The invisible engineer, the woman who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Prologue, the opening. May 24, 1883, New York City. President Chester A. Arthur stands on a platform draped in red, white, and blue bunting. Behind him rises the Brooklyn Bridge, 595 feet of suspension cables, granite towers, and steel wire stretching across the East River. The largest suspension bridge ever built, an engineering marvel that people said was impossible. 50,000 people have gathered for the opening ceremony. Fireworks explode overhead. Bands play. The president prepares to speak. Today, Arthur begins, we celebrate the vision of John Augustus Roebling, whose genius conceived this magnificent structure, and the dedication of his son, Washington Roebling, who saw that vision through to completion despite tremendous personal sacrifice. The crowd erupts in cheers. Washington Roebling sits in a carriage nearby, too ill to stand. He waves weakly. The crowd cheers louder. What President Arthur doesn't mention, what nobody mentions, what the newspapers won't report, what history books won't record for another century, is that Washington Roebling hasn't actually run the Brooklyn Bridge project in over a decade. He's been too sick, bedridden, barely able to move. For the last 11 years, someone else has been in charge. Someone who studied the engineering plans, made the calculations, supervised the construction, solved the problems, and saw this impossible bridge through to completion. That someone is watching from a window in Brooklyn Heights. A 39-year-old woman who taught herself engineering, who learned higher mathematics in secret, who spent 11 years doing work she could never claim credit for. Her name is Emily Warren Roebling. And this is the story of how she built the Brooklyn Bridge and how history forgot. Part 1. The Impossible Bridge, 1869. The idea of a bridge connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn had been considered impossible for decades. The East River was too wide, too deep, too chaotic with shipping traffic. Engineers had proposed designs and given up. The technology didn't exist. The materials weren't strong enough. The money couldn't be raised. Then John Augustus Roebling said, I can do it. Roebling was already famous. He'd built suspension bridges across the Niagara River, the Allegheny River, the Ohio River. He'd pioneered the use of steel wire cables. He was 63 years old, brilliant, difficult, and absolutely certain of his own genius. His design for the Brooklyn Bridge was audacious. 2 massive granite towers rising 276 feet above the water, connected by 4 steel cables, each 16 inches thick, supporting a roadway that would carry carriages, pedestrians, and eventually elevated trains. It would be the longest suspension bridge in the world. It would be an engineering achievement unlike anything ever attempted. In 1869, New York approved the project. John Roebling was named chief engineer. His son, Washington Roebling, would serve as assistant engineer. Washington was 32, educated at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, experienced in bridge construction. He'd fought in the Civil War, rising to the rank of colonel. He was competent, careful, and entirely overshadowed by his father's reputation. John Roebling began immediately. In June 1869, he was surveying the Brooklyn waterfront, determining exactly where the bridge's towers should be positioned. He was standing on a dock when a ferry came in too fast, crushing his foot against a piling. The injury seemed minor at first, but John Roebling refused medical treatment beyond basic cleaning. He believed in water therapy, natural healing, his own stubborn independence. The wound became infected, tetanus set in. John Augustus Roebling died on July 22, 1869, 3 weeks after the accident. He'd never driven a single support beam for his greatest bridge. Washington Roebling inherited an impossible project. Part 2. The Education of Emily Warren, 1843-1869. Emily Warren was born in 1843 in Cold Spring, New York, to a prosperous family. Her father was a state assemblyman. Her mother emphasized education for all 12 Warren children, daughters included, unusual for the era. Emily attended private schools, studied languages, mathematics, and literature. She was intellectually curious, reading everything she could find. But in 1860s America, a woman's education was expected to prepare her for marriage and motherhood, nothing more. In 1864, at age 21, Emily met Washington Roebling at a military camp during the Civil War. She was visiting her brother, an Army officer. Washington was a colonel in the Union Army Engineering Corps. They talked about engineering. Washington was surprised to find a woman interested in technical subjects. Emily was surprised to find a man who took her interest seriously. They married in January 1865, just months before the war ended. For the next 4 years, Emily was a traditional wife. She ran the household. She gave birth to their son, John, in 1868. She supported Washington's career. Then Washington's father died, and Washington became chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge. Emily could have remained in the background, should have by society's expectations, but Washington needed help. The project was massive, complex, and terrifying. He was replacing a legendary engineer, his own father, on the most ambitious construction project in American history. The pressure was immense. Emily started helping with correspondence, then with organizing paperwork. Then she started reading the engineering plans. She'd always been good with mathematics. Now she started studying engineering texts, treatises on suspension bridges, materials science, structural calculations. Washington would explain concepts to her. She'd read, study, ask questions. It was supposed to be just support, helping her husband manage an overwhelming workload. Then in 1872, everything changed. Part 3, the CAISSONS, 1871-872. Building the Brooklyn Bridge required sinking massive foundations deep into the riverbed. To do this, engineers used caissons, enormous wooden boxes, sealed and pressurized, that would be sunk into the river. Workers would enter the caissons and dig out mud and rock, allowing the structures to sink deeper until they hit bedrock. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work. The caissons were pressurized to keep water out, which meant workers experienced dramatic pressure changes when entering and exiting. Nobody understood the medical consequences yet. Nobody knew about decompression sickness, the bends, the potentially fatal condition caused by nitrogen bubbles forming in the blood when pressure decreases too quickly. Washington Roebling spent hundreds of hours in the caissons, supervising the work personally. He was a hands-on engineer, unwilling to ask workers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. In 1872, after an especially long shift in the Brooklyn caisson, Washington emerged feeling strange, dizzy, disoriented, severe pain in his joints. He collapsed. A doctor was called. Washington was diagnosed with caisson disease, what we now know as severe decompression sickness. The nitrogen bubbles in his blood had caused neurological damage. He survived, but the effects were devastating and permanent. Washington could barely walk. He experienced constant pain. Bright light hurt his eyes. Loud noises caused agonizing headaches. He had tremors in his hands. His speech became slurred when he was tired. He was 35 years old, and he'd just been crippled by his own bridge. The project board met to discuss replacing him. The Brooklyn Bridge was years from completion. They needed a chief engineer who could work full-time, who could visit the construction site daily, who could manage hundreds of workers. Washington Roebling was clearly unable to do any of that. Emily attended that meeting. She was not invited. She was not a member of the board. She was not an engineer. She was Washington's wife, and wives didn't attend business meetings. She came anyway. "Gentlemen," she told the assembled board members, "my husband cannot visit the construction site daily, but he can still engineer this bridge. His mind is unaffected. His knowledge is complete. He can provide direction, solve problems, make decisions." From his sickbed, one board member asked skeptically. "Yes," Emily said, "from his sickbed with my assistance." The room went silent. "Mrs. Roebling," the board chairman said carefully, "are you proposing that you would? What exactly? Carry messages, take notes." "I'm proposing that I would serve as my husband's representative on site. I would inspect the work, convey his instructions, report back on progress and problems. He would make the engineering decisions. I would ensure they're properly implemented." It was absurd. A woman serving as de facto chief engineer on the largest construction project in America, impossible, unprecedented, scandalous. But the alternative was replacing Washington entirely. And the board knew that finding another engineer willing to take on this cursed project would be difficult. They reluctantly agreed to a trial period. Emily Warren Roebling had just talked her way into a job that didn't exist, doing work she wasn't trained for, in a field that didn't admit women. Now she just had to learn how to actually do it. Part 4. The Education, 1872-1873. Emily had studied engineering texts casually. Now she had to master them completely. She read everything: treatises on suspension bridges, materials science, structural engineering, calculus, physics. She studied her father-in-law's original designs, understanding not just what the plans showed but why, the mathematics and physics underlying every decision. Washington taught her what he could, but his condition was unpredictable. Some days he was lucid, able to explain complex concepts. Other days the pain was too severe and he could barely speak. Emily learned to work independently. She taught herself higher mathematics, the calculus needed to calculate cable tensions, load distributions, stress forces. She studied the properties of steel, understanding how different manufacturing processes affected strength and flexibility. She learned construction terminology, management techniques, how to read technical drawings and surveyors' reports. Most importantly, she learned how to command respect from men who didn't believe women belonged in engineering. This was the hardest part. When Emily first appeared at the construction site in 1872, the workers were confused, then amused. A woman, here to inspect their work. This had to be some kind of joke. The site supervisor, a rough Irish immigrant named Sullivan who'd worked construction his entire adult life, initially refused to speak to her. "Tell Mr. Roebling he needs to send someone with authority," Sullivan told her. "I have authority," Emily replied calmly. "I represent the chief engineer." "You represent your husband. That's not the same thing." "Then explain to me why the Southern Anchorage Foundation is 3 inches off the specifications we discussed last week." Sullivan stared at her. The foundation was indeed 3 inches off, but how did she know? Had Washington told her? Had she measured herself? We had to adjust for the bedrock composition," he said defensively. "I understand that, but a 3-inch adjustment affects cable tension calculations, which means we need to recalculate the northern anchorage positioning as well. Otherwise, the bridge will be asymmetrical." Sullivan blinked. She was right, and she'd just done engineering mathematics in her head, standing in the mud of a construction site in a full Victorian dress. I'll have the men make the adjustment," he said slowly. Emily nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I'll be back tomorrow to inspect the Northern Tower Foundation. Please have your progress reports ready." She walked away, back straight, face composed. Inside, she was terrified. She just guessed about the asymmetrical issue. She wasn't completely certain of the mathematics. She'd have to calculate it properly tonight, make sure she was right. But she'd established something crucial. She knew what she was talking about, and she wouldn't be dismissed. Over the next months, this pattern repeated. Emily would appear at the construction site. Workers would challenge her directly or indirectly. She would demonstrate knowledge, solve problems, prove competence. Slowly, very slowly, she gained grudging respect. By late 1873, when Emily Warren Roebling walked onto the construction site, workers stopped what they were doing and paid attention. Not because she was a woman, because she was the engineer. Part 5. The Crisis, 1876-1878. In 1876, the Brooklyn Bridge project faced a crisis that threatened to shut down construction entirely. The problem was the cable wire. John Roebling's original design called for cables made of thousands of individual steel wires bound together, each wire carefully tested for strength. The contractor hired to provide the wire was J. Lloyd Hague, who'd worked on previous Roebling projects. But Hague was cutting corners. He was supposed to provide wire that could withstand 160,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. Instead, he was delivering inferior wire, weak, poorly manufactured, sometimes outright defective, and covering it up with falsified inspection reports. By the time Emily discovered the fraud, thousands of feet of bad wire had already been installed in the bridge's cables. She found the problem through meticulous record-keeping. She'd been tracking wire deliveries, cross-referencing them with strength tests, and noticed inconsistencies. Batches that should have tested identically showed different results. Some wire was breaking at pressures far below specification. Emily brought her findings to Washington. Together, they tested wire samples themselves. The results were damning. Approximately 20% of the installed wire was defective. This was a catastrophic problem. The bridge's safety depended on cable strength. If 20% of the wire was weak, the entire structure could fail. Thousands of people could die. The solution was obvious. Remove all the defective wire and replace it. But this would delay construction by years and cost hundreds of thousands of additional dollars. The project was already over budget and behind schedule. The board would never approve it. Emily proposed an alternative. The bridge's cables had redundancy built in. They were stronger than strictly necessary to support the expected load. Even with 20% defective wire, the remaining good wire could still support the bridge, but with a much smaller safety margin. The question was, could they add enough additional wire to compensate for the defective wire without removing it? Emily spent 3 weeks doing calculations, complex mathematics involving cable geometry, load distribution, wire strength variations, safety factors. She filled notebooks with equations, checking and rechecking her work. Finally, she determined that by adding 150 additional wires to each cable, wires she would personally verify for quality, they could achieve acceptable safety margins even with the defective wire remaining in place. She presented this solution to the project board in June 1876. The board was skeptical. How could they trust calculations made by a woman? What if she was wrong? Emily showed her work, every equation, every assumption, every safety calculation. One board member, an engineer himself, spent 2 days reviewing her mathematics. He found no errors. The board approved her solution. Construction continued. The Brooklyn Bridge was saved by Emily Warren Roebling's mathematical genius, and nobody outside the project board ever knew. Part 6. The Invisible Years, 1873-1883. For 11 years, Emily Warren Roebling ran the Brooklyn Bridge project. Every day, she would wake early, review correspondence and technical reports, meet with Washington to discuss engineering problems and decisions, then travel to the construction site. She would inspect the work, answer questions, solve problems, make decisions. She would return home, write detailed reports, update plans, perform calculations. Then she would attend to her other responsibilities, running a household, raising her son, maintaining social obligations expected of a woman of her class. She was working two full-time jobs simultaneously, and she couldn't publicly acknowledge one of them. When newspaper reporters came to interview the chief engineer, they spoke to Washington, who would receive them in his sickbed, speaking carefully when his condition allowed. Emily would sit nearby, taking notes. When Washington struggled to remember technical details or became too exhausted to continue, Emily would quietly supply information, which Washington would relay as his own. When contractors needed decisions, they would officially request them from Washington Roebling, chief engineer. Unofficially, they knew to ask Mrs. Roebling, who would actually make the decision. When technical problems arose, Emily would solve them, then write up the solution as if it came from Washington. She became expert at invisibility. There are photographs from this era showing the Brooklyn Bridge under construction. In some of them, if you look carefully at the background, you can see a woman in a long dress standing among the workers, clipboard in hand. That's Emily. But the photographs are labeled Brooklyn Bridge Construction, Chief Engineer Washington Roebling supervising. Emily isn't mentioned in the captions. She's literally in the picture, and history still made her invisible. Part 7, the opening 1883. May 24, 1883. After 14 years of construction, after 20 lives lost to accidents, after millions of dollars spent, after countless engineering challenges overcome, the Brooklyn Bridge opens to the public. President Arthur gives his speech. Washington Roebling sits in his carriage, too ill to stand, accepting congratulations. Emily watches from her window. She's not on the platform. She's not mentioned in the speeches. The newspapers will report on John Roebling's original vision and Washington Roebling's dedication, but Emily's name will appear only in passing, if at all. 1 week after the opening, the American Society of Civil Engineers holds a celebration dinner honoring Washington Roebling. Emily is not invited. The society doesn't admit women. Washington sends a letter to be read at the dinner. In it, he writes, "I want it to be understood that she is as much responsible for the successful completion of the bridge as I am. No one knows better than I do the amount of work she has done. I am in no position to contradict any statements she might make about the construction details." It's the closest Washington ever comes to publicly acknowledging what Emily has done. The Society politely ignores this paragraph in his letter when they publish excerpts in their proceedings. Part 8, the aftermath 1883-1903. After the bridge opens, Emily continues managing the administrative aftermath. Final payments to contractors, dispute resolutions, technical documentation. She also begins writing. She authors technical papers on bridge construction, though they're published under Washington's name. She gives public lectures about the bridge, carefully framed as her sharing her husband's engineering insights. In 1896, she petitions Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute to admit women to their engineering program. Her petition is denied. Washington's health never fully recovers. He remains semi-invalid for the rest of his life, though he does resume some engineering work from home. Emily assists him, but no longer runs entire projects. There are no more Brooklyn bridges. She throws herself into other activities. She becomes active in women's education advocacy. She earns a law degree from New York University in 1899, at age 56, becoming one of the first women to do so. In 1903, Washington Roebling finally gives an interview where he states explicitly, "I could not have built the Brooklyn Bridge without my wife's help. She made it possible." By then, Emily is 60. The bridge has been open for 20 years. History has already been written. Washington dies in 1926. age 89. His obituaries celebrate him as the brilliant engineer who built the Brooklyn Bridge despite devastating illness. Emily is mentioned in passing as his devoted wife, who helped him during his illness. Emily Warren Roebling dies in 1903, at age 59, just months after Washington's public acknowledgement. Her obituary in the New York Times is 4 sentences long. It mentions that she was Washington Roebling's wife and that she took an interest in her husband's work. 4 sentences for the woman who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Part 9. The Rediscovery 1982-024. For nearly a century after Emily's death, she remained a footnote in Brooklyn Bridge history. If she was mentioned at all, it was as the devoted wife who carried messages between her invalid husband and the construction site. Then, in the 1980s, historian David McCullough began researching for his book, The Great Bridge. He had access to the Roebling family papers, thousands of pages of letters, technical notes, calculations, and documents. What he found astonished him. The papers made it clear that Emily hadn't just helped with the Brooklyn Bridge. She'd run the project. The technical calculations were in her handwriting. The problem-solving approaches showed her mathematical style. The correspondence revealed that contractors were writing directly to her, not to Washington, for decisions. McCullough's book, published in 1972, was the first major work to give Emily proper credit. He wrote, "For more than 10 years, Emily Warren Roebling was the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge in all but name. She did the mathematics, made the technical decisions, solved the engineering problems. Washington Roebling was the titular chief engineer, but Emily was the reality." Even then, the revelation was met with skepticism. Really? A woman building the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1870s? It took decades more research, more historians combing through archives, more evidence emerging before Emily's role became widely accepted. In 2018, a plaque was finally installed on the Brooklyn Bridge acknowledging Emily Warren Roebling's contributions. It reads, "Behind every great man is a great woman. Emily Warren Roebling was that woman for Washington Roebling. She became his eyes and ears at the construction site, and more, she became his chief engineer in all but title." It's better than nothing, but notice the language, behind every great man. Even in acknowledging her, the plaque subordinates her. She wasn't behind Washington Roebling, she was the engineer. In 2021, a statue of Emily Warren Roebling was unveiled near the Brooklyn Bridge. She stands alone, holding the bridge's technical plans, looking determined. It took 138 years for her to get a statue. The men who built 1/10 of what she built got statues immediately. Epilogue, the pattern. Emily Warren Roebling's story isn't unique. It's part of a pattern that repeats throughout architectural and engineering history. When a woman makes significant contributions to a major project, her work gets attributed to a man, usually her husband, father, or male colleague. Sometimes she's deliberately erased. More often, she's simply assumed to be peripheral, supportive, not genuinely important. This happens because we can't imagine women as builders, as engineers, as architects of great works. We can imagine them as helpers, inspirers, supporters, but not as the primary intelligence. So when the evidence shows a woman was central, we reframe it. We minimize it. We find ways to make it smaller, less important, more compatible with our assumptions. Emily Warren Roebling built the Brooklyn Bridge. This is not metaphor. This is not exaggeration. She learned engineering mathematics. She solved technical problems. She made construction decisions. She managed contractors. She overcame the fraud crisis. She saw the project through 14 years to completion. But for 138 years, history gave credit to men. Not because the men lied. Washington Roebling tried to give Emily credit. He stated publicly that she was responsible for the bridge's completion. But because society couldn't hear it, couldn't process it, couldn't reconcile woman with built the Brooklyn Bridge, so it erased her, made her invisible, turned her into a footnote in her own achievement. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands. Over 150,000 people cross it every day. Millions of tourists photograph it every year. Almost none of them know who actually built it. That's the real tragedy of Emily Warren Roebling's story. Not that she had to work in secret, not that she couldn't claim credit during her lifetime, but that even now, even after the evidence has emerged, even after historians have documented her role thoroughly, most people still don't know her name. Walk across the Brooklyn Bridge today. Stand in the middle and look up at the cables, the towers, the sweeping architecture. You're standing inside Emily Warren Roebling's mind. Her mathematics made those cables hold. Her calculations positioned those towers. Her problem-solving overcame every crisis. She built this, and history forgot. That's the cost of invisibility, not just to Emily, but to all of us. Because if we don't know who actually built our monuments, we don't truly understand our own history. We don't know what's possible. We don't see the full picture of human achievement. Emily Warren Roebling proved that a woman could master advanced mathematics, could solve complex engineering problems, could manage massive construction projects. She proved it in 1872. And yet, 150 years later, we're still surprised when women excel in engineering. Still asking if women are naturally suited for technical fields. Still treating female engineers as exceptions rather than as continuing a tradition that includes the woman who built one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history. The Brooklyn Bridge is Emily Warren Roebling's monument. It's past time we acknowledge that. Every suspension bridge built since owes a debt to her work. Every female engineer today walks in her footsteps, whether they know it or not. She was brilliant, she was capable, she was the engineer. Remember her name, Emily Warren Roebling, the woman who built the Brooklyn Bridge. Author's note: this account is based on extensive historical research, including David McCullough's The Great Bridge, the Roebling family papers at Rutgers University, technical documents from the Brooklyn Bridge construction, and biographical research on Emily Warren Roebling. The major events described: Washington Roebling's illness, Emily's 11 years managing the project, the wire fraud crisis, her mathematical calculations, are all documented historical facts. Some conversations and specific details have been reconstructed from available evidence, as complete documentation of day-to-day interactions doesn't exist. What's undeniable is Emily's central role in the Brooklyn Bridge's completion. The evidence is overwhelming. She wasn't just helping her husband. She was engineering the bridge. The tragedy is how long it took for this to be recognized, and how many people still don't know the truth. Emily Warren Roebling deserves to be remembered as one of the great engineers of the 19th century. This is her story.